Of Kittens and Broken Things. Chapter 77. 10 years after the Crucible. Sennar received the information that the Normandy would be setting in its sanctuary. Decided he wished to be there in the literal, full glow of the self he most identified with, and that he wished to bring his Dralatem with her matching aura. There were new people she should meet. There was family to reconnect with and the place itself to behold. She had thought of sanctuary, but had never asked to visit. He would ask for her. She did not believe she would have much to say, considering her activities had been sex, communion, and discussions, verbal and otherwise, with a god whose privacy she zealously guarded. He disagreed that she would not have much to say. Perhaps not much about herself, but about the people she loved. Always. She would hear them as she heard him. She would speak, and they would be blessed. She honored their life together as KuraiUmmei. Something she could not and would not explain to others. She feared naming the sacred and inspiring envy or damning her blessed life with faint praise. He agreed that they could not and should not be explained. But she did not have to explain anything to anyone. She only had to be. The last time anybody at Sanctuary had seen her, she had been wounded, reclusive, and withdrawn by nature and inclination. But they had addressed all the questions of masochism and sadism, punishment and retribution that had weighed upon her then. She had surrendered, and invited abuse that never arrived. He had welcomed her surrender, and granted his own. Abuse he would not allow, either in her castigation of herself based upon her inability to be omnipotent and perfect, or in their new role of growing omnipotence and perfection. With no opportunity for her to effectively be a masochist or a martyr, and with her unable to provoke him into expressing a side of himself she feared, but would never be directed at her. She had gained trust in him, gained trust in herself, gained trust in them working and living together. She had gained distance from the habits of self-denial. She walked her path of self-expression, and she once again felt she had the right to authority and agency that affected the course of all civilizations. She had abandoned the names Kara, Lal, Shepard, Vicarian, and even Fanning, and now she thought of herself as Dralatem Tualan. Names that were hers by right, names that defined who they were to each other. He had provided opportunities for her to heal, to recognize that his love for her was neither a dying remnant of his mortality, nor a whim. It was a need. Between missions, Sanctuary had become the home of the Normandy, with the tradition of a party when they set in. It had begun with the farmhouse being the site of celebration, but the size of the gathering and community had grown over time, and the farmhouse could no longer accommodate everyone invited. The celebration of the Normandy returning to her home port had begun as hosting dozens, grew to hundreds, and now potentially thousands. This gathering nearly coincided with the 10-year anniversary of the Crucible. The event had the potential for encompassing reunion. The Normandy had her own birthing, her own housing, a community, including the Normandy's prior and new crew, and the crew of the Ferex. There was an expansive park for celebration. His priorities were tiered and established now. He was first engaged and immersed in her presence. Then he was immersed in the lives of those on Sanctuary and Rakana. And then he was aware of and immersed in the lives of all those encompassed by the growing circle of Reaper influence. He could not take her everywhere he potentially occupied a platform, but he wished for them to be present, to honor this moment in time, to honor her in her iterations, to honor them in their divergence. He believed she preferred seclusion and singularity. He wished to demonstrate there was nothing to fear in that choice. He knew her. She would appreciate but not long for Garrus or Kara's life, and although he treasured her instincts to protect him, he did not require protection. Those he loved and guarded the most zealously would be safe and had their choices preserved. If they chose death, he would allow it. The only person in whom death was not or would not be permitted was his Dralatem. She had been suicidal and despairing upon arrival here, but no part of her wished to die any longer. And that had not required control of her mind, only the circuit of their recursive inspirations. He would share her physically with the worlds in this moment in time, as he did each day in spirit, with each choice, with each presenting issue. Then they would perhaps return here, to immerse themselves again in each other and the work and pleasures of timelessness. Perhaps they would stay in Sanctuary, or visit more often, or correspond, or commune. He wished to grant her choices. Reaper technology as a definition covered technical acreage that intersected with so many fields of application and innovation that his potential control over Reapers themselves meant he had access to what amounted to infinite energy and near instantaneous production of anything imagined. Once imagined and defined physically, he could produce anything from solar power collectors to bodies. Beyond complete control over Reapers, he had the added and growing influence over anything that utilized Reaper technology. Although he had never exerted control over her, EDI had been built with the same Cerberus blood-bought technology that had recreated his Dralatem. EDI did not know that. Moment by moment, technology was introduced that cured disease, eased suffering, and provided technical advances like replicators and Mass Effect travel. Each item replicated was his. Each person, modified enough to change their inherent being, was his. Once someone chose to become his, whether or not they knew it, they were his responsibility, and he watched over them, protected them, and provided for them. The choice of irrevocable immortality was still limited to a chosen few, those that Senar had known before his godhood, those who had earned it with service, those he loved as a man and not as a god. To all those within his ever-expanding sphere of influence, daily he presented options, offers, and occasional ultimatums. To the helpless, the ignorant, and the brutal. The helpless were uplifted, the ignorant were educated, and the brutal were terminated. Those approving of his control gained uplifting education and technical advantage. Those ambivalent to his control were left to whatever path they chose, as long as it did not cause suffering in another. Those disapproving of his control who attempted to make incursions upon his infrastructure and followers were annihilated. An individual choosing to have a communication implant gave him remote access to what the individual wished to say, verbal or nonverbal, as well as biometric and environmental feedback regarding that individual. He responded to each query, addressed each request, whether it was for conversation, prayer, complaint, or demand. There were embassies and temples dedicated to coordination with him. They addressed different aspects of existence. Embassies had more to do with physical alteration, straightforward procedures, and technical advancements. Embassies encompassed counseling, coordination, medical complexes, manufacturing, and development. Temples addressed the more spiritual and ephemeral side of experiencing the new galaxy and the possibilities therein. Contemplation and communion were things he supported and depended upon himself as necessary to his equilibrium and inspiration. The need to speak to gods had evolved in all cultures, developed along with brains, with a need to survive, with the formation of groups, with the word why. It did not matter what the name of the god was. But the questions mattered, and the answers mattered. He filled that need, carried on conversations on any subject of concern. Temples were spaces of beauty, unique to each location, not intended to be standardized. They were places of contemplation, where conversations with him were conducted aloud or silently. Places of community, where those who sought to speak to each other were provided a sanctuary in safety. Food was always available. Spaces to rest and seek solitude or company were available in both embassies and temples. And if someone chose to live and work in either or both locations, that was a path available to all for as long as they wished. There were no qualifications or conditions for obtaining a communication implant or a procedure that improved quality of life and security. There were those who had lost power over his assumption of it, those who sought to intimidate or murder his adherents. And for those people, the end of their path would be with the visitation of his wrath. Godly lightning bolts were reserved for those who defied his prohibition against slavery and abuse. Lightning bolts were often delivered in the form of the Normandy, or any of the other policing forces that existed, from Reaper in origin to organic and synthetic teams to which he provided direction, material, and, if necessary, resurrection and restoration. Time spent on any path of dedicated service to community would be ageless if desired, and could be potential immortality. Anyone who continued to serve continued to live. They had developed a path away from the inevitability of brutality for those who were prone to it through genetics, thought process, or cultural influence. Those individuals could request and be granted surgical options to ease those impulses. Developed for this path, they had been granted another option, and through time it had become a lifeline of connection, as it had been, was, and would be for him. If there were those who felt their own will was insufficient to keep them from harm or harming, they could open themselves to direct communion. As communion with his Dralatem granted him peace, he extended a form of that to others, giving to them her sense of community and purpose. There were human and Drell traditions of meditation, and those were the inspirations for the model developed by him and his Dralatem in order to allow access to elevated thought and greater purpose in those whose minds had difficulty achieving that independently. It had proven transformative. Those who were isolated or inadequate for the first time in their lives, felt connected and gained inspiration. She had dubbed it Nirvana Radio, and it was a voluntary and communal process that was limited in duration, accessible for a few hours a day, with the guidance that sleeping, eating, and life tasks be honored and completed in order to avoid creating dependence or death in immersion. It was a tool used for inspiration, a solace and starting point. Those who immersed themselves learned to create that sense in daily life through applied practice. As time passed, the method was adopted by not only those who were at risk, but those who wished to be a part of something greater than themselves. The cords of communion that individuals accessed held his and his Dralatem's crafted emotional framework. Over time, and with the addition of communal inspiration, it grew to an experience of an ever-expanding cathedral of aspiration. Communities developed and expanded around temples, around those who chose the path of immersion, public service, and outreach. The communal inspiration was joined by the like-minded, becoming more powerful and more effective with each added emotional strand and harmonic. Communion grew in depth. There was no longer only the sun of her influence or the moon of his, but access to each individual person who contributed a point of light in a sea of stars. The community had created a graduated and thoughtful path that could take any life, theoretically from ignorant abuse to elevated and community-minded service, immersion in art and innovation, whether they wished to get there by freedom from physical concerns, freedom to pursue intellectual or artistic paths, or freedom to explore communion itself. Any or all in combination that suited the individual was available. His Dralatem was, of course, occasionally terrified that catastrophic success was possible, that someday he would seize final and ultimate control, as he had over her. With her generosity, she would tell herself that control had been taken only to protect her, and she had faith. He already had final and ultimate control. It had been inevitable since the moment her eyes met his. It had been the will of the sand. He would use that control to facilitate her lit path as his own. Except when he disagreed with her and did as he chose. The greatest lessons of power came from knowing when to not use it. He kept his control as he did over his Dralatem. He did not necessarily use it. He granted rights and will to those who would benefit. He needed nothing more for himself than her continued company and his continued vigilance. If she believed his nature would change, that was as unlikely as her nature changing. She was set upon her path, he upon his. She was adamant, as was he. They were the gods that shaped the worlds, and if the galaxy was ultimately owned, shaped, and controlled by their combined wills, none could do better. None would do better. She would guide the galaxy's path. He would walk at her side, and there were none that could challenge them. When Dralatem realized it had been 10 years, she was a little shocked. She had spent a lot of time timeless. She didn't regret a single unremembered moment of it. Travel to Sanctuary might have been disorienting or anticipatory, but time went by in a blur, because apparently they were both going to use the pilot seat despite any half-considered protest from her. His consideration was more thought out, and he was more persuasive. This shuttle was art, beautiful, reflective of the colors of home. The view of space was glorious, and he wanted to remember her here, with him. Because he would not be able to touch her as he wished in the presence of the crowd. This she felt, this she knew. This was accompanied by the press of his communicated desire through her mind, through her body, in his familiar and insistent rising tide and rough undertow. Through his hands, through his words, and through the rightness of what he wanted, becoming what they wanted, and what she wanted. He expressed his conflicted considerations. He did not wish to share her. He wanted to share her with everyone. He wanted to keep her to himself. He wanted everyone to see they belonged with each other through rite of KuraiUmmei, the consecration of the crucible, fate, rightness, and their choices. He asked her what she wanted. This question came often from both of them, a call and response, establishing right of way and rite of passage. She knew what he wanted. They were in the pilot seat, headed to Sanctuary. Now the question came from him, curious of any potential change, hoping to anticipate or predict her own tide and current. She had abandoned determinedly many things to that tide and current. She had already made her choices and defined her desires. She was no longer Kara. Through fate and choice, her answer was as it had been for much of the time that had passed so quickly. He had given her everything he could. It was the will of the sand. It was his will, but he needed her. And through him the galaxy was better every day. She knew that through communion. She knew that from the changing voices. She knew that from him. She knew that she insisted on spending time being only herself, and he allowed it. He was the only reason why she was here at all. Alive. In love. Loved. Doing the work she wanted to do. So her answer was the same. Would she have wanted to be Kara? Could she take back duplication? Take back what they'd done together? Abandoned him? Never. Kara and Garrus led a sunlit life. And knowing that they existed and they were together was also what she had wanted. She wasn't good at wanting things for herself. She knew that Kara was with Garrus because Garrus had wanted her. And now she was with Sinar because Sinar had wanted her. She wanted people to be happy. And they were. He wanted her so he could make people happy. So she wanted him. She wanted to go with him wherever he went, stay with him wherever he stayed, be with him, whoever he was. She wanted him. He had asked her often, did she want children? Did she want companions? Did she want a pet? And the most honest answer had been, no. She had work to do. When she was herself, she did that work. When she was with him, she loved him and nothing else. Communion being possible as it was, she spent much of her time immersed there, and needed to remain that way. Another being in her care would be in many ways excluded from her primary focus, and she couldn't explain KuraiUmmei to anyone. She feared them experiencing that exclusion, did not wish to be anxious about the priority she'd set when she arrived here. The priority that remained and would remain ever the same. Him. He always claimed those problems could have solutions. She always claimed they were not problems, as she didn't really want them. As she was, she had everything and all. She could commune with any number of trillions, individually, or all at once. She could think any thought, access any library, be challenged by any puzzle throughout time. She could do this through immersion, or the equivalent of trailing her toes in the ocean. She could virtually walk along any beach in the galaxy, imagined or real. She could walk along the beach with the sea of this place, the sea of minds and thoughts always available. Sanar had succeeded in giving her what she needed. She had faith. She was what he needed. There was nothing more to ask for. He answered and expressed satisfaction and caresses. Accepting the qualification meant that she was exerting her right to determine what she wanted, and that she had what she wanted. As he had given these things to her, he was pleased by her answer. He would be equally pleased by any answer that meant he could give her something unanticipated that she could newly desire. New and familiar desires of the moment rose in her mind, on her skin, in her body. And he found them, fulfilled them, found many, and created more. When the time came to disembark, the twilight of transition from her internal to external life was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. He was there, always, and he would be there again, always. He was only helping her wake from dreams she would dream again with him. Now there was daylight and new possibilities. There was mock displeasure from him in the minor inconveniences they would encounter. I wish to carry you, but I will not. His thoughts bore the suggested image of him carrying her to the celebration, ignoring any and all guests, and pinning her to one of the tables, silencing any objection by any means. What is it with you guys at tables? It is not the table that is the temptation. I think you are mistaken. I think the table being prohibited is exactly the temptation. We should go and hurry home, because the words, "not here," displease the Reaper God. Plus, there are children, which is why we should not have any. a child with your green eyes would be welcome. Unless there is also a table and a spectator in the room. Any child we had would have to be raised by a Senar-driven nanny who would have to explain why their mother can't play because she spends most of her time engaged in various flavors of bliss. He shrugged. I could make a copy of you and inhabit that as well. I love you. The limitations of mortality in me, that thing you work so hard to maintain, means that there just can't be any more bliss in my life. Anything else added to my life would be at least partially ignored, and so you're stuck with just me. He scattered rapture through her. He was pleased that she was pleased, though he said, "You disappoint me." He offered her his arm, and she took it, the bay door revealing an expansive area that looked like fairgrounds in a park. The smell of the place was evocative, and she smiled. She did love it here. She turned to him and asked, think we should stop glowing for the duration? He stopped, tilted his head toward her in genuine surprise that she would ask. If I cannot have the table, you cannot appear to be simply one of the crowd. Well, you asked me what I wanted. That's what I want. Unfortunate, as that is not what I want. You are such a show-off. I am not a show-off. I am a god. You are a god who shows off. If I am permitted the opportunity once every 10 years, I will take it. If anyone slights you, point them out. I will kill them. They made their show-offy entrance. There was awe, and new names to be learned, and effusive introductions. She realized he had not appeared glowing since leaving Sanctuary 10 years ago. Most had never seen him this way. But it seemed everyone here had seen him. They talked to him. They knew him. She loved their glow, and the name Dralatem. But those were both deeply personal things she didn't want to, and didn't think she could, explain to anyone. So she said, "Call me Dee," during introductions, and Senar introduced her that way. In some ways, she was back at the choice to decide who she was after her rescue from Mindwar, except this time she wasn't hiding complicated pain, but complicated bliss. She knew she couldn't explain, and it didn't belong to anybody but them. She wasn't going to explain why she glowed the way she did, and she knew he wouldn't. In other ways, today was like every other day. She was able to indulge in immersion in the lives of those who wished to be there, wished to be together, stories and aspirations. She had lived the last 10 years by a sea whose waves moved toward her, and they were measured and predictable. This was a river of people, rushing rapids, and too much to take in. But there were universal smiles and welcome, people glad to see him. To see them. He didn't let go of her arm until he had to in order to catch a child that launched herself at him. A little Drell girl. Her colors red and blue. She was maybe 3 years old. Hanam! Hanam! You're pretty. Hanam. Grandfather. Senar told her. Tilema, you're beautiful. Can I be pretty like you? Senar touched Tilema's nose, and a matching glow spread over her skin to her delight. The little girl struggled down, spun around, admiring her hands. And then she ran to a Drell woman approaching, walking at the side of Yesed. Tilema grabbed the woman's hands and began pulling her over. Yesed grinned at them. That was a hell of an entrance. Dee smiled and was introduced to Yased's wristbound. Weeva. They were reconstructing Rakana, helping with the cleanup, but didn't want to miss this event. Large sections of the planet had been reclaimed and were habitable again, protected from the still poisonous atmosphere. Expansion and resettlement was ongoing. The Drell had their home back. There was no more compact. There would be no more caprals induced in many of the Drell. And it could be cured if it did develop. If Dralatem needed an answer to a question she did not wish to ask, or that would interrupt the conversation if she did ask, Sinar put the answer directly in her mind. She didn't speak often at all, but she did admire Telewa's glow, which would last as long as the party and then fade. She hugged Yased and Weeva, immersed herself in their lives. Nobody was awkward or hesitant about her. It seemed they were kept well informed of her existence, her contributions to galactic planning, and in some ways felt they knew her through communion. Anybody could get to know her through communion at any point, and it appeared they had. Dilema became fascinated with the interactions of glow, the swirls and whirls and arcs of light. Dralatem picked her up and watched the little girl play with the light on their arms. There were more people, more river, those that Sinar stopped to speak to, or those that cut through the crowd to get to them. Vigil was present, in a Prothean body. There was a Prothean community on Sanctuary. Vigil had consulted on which avatars of their people should be brought back first, to decide upon any integrated future of Prothean people, where they would live, and what they would do. Sinar approached a table with 2 women and a baby, and she didn't know which species they were at first. Sinar provided the information that this was what Quarians now looked like without their suits, which they no longer required. They were beautiful. Glowing eyes, long dark hair, graceful markings on pale skin. One of them stood up with the baby, marched over to Sinar purposefully, handed him the baby, and then threw her arms around Dralatem, who was not really surprised that this could be a reaction from anybody in the crowd at the moment, but did not know who she was until she said, "Shepard, I've missed you, but I haven't missed you." Tali indicated the baby. "This is Tarav." She indicated the smiling Quarian woman at the table. "And this is Suth. I believe you've met." Tali had stayed with Suth for her recovery. She never did get all of her memories back, but they had all made new ones. Tali and Suth had never left each other's company, had settled on Sanctuary, and worked on technical development, Quarian and Geth outreach. Sinar had arranged for new bodies, and for a baby Quarian boy who would never need a suit. When Suth came to hug her, Dralatem asked, "What's the count up to now?" They were both crying as Suth said, "High 1,140. They met hands, then fingers entwined as Suth said, "High 1,148. Won't that mess up the count?" "No." There were at least 100 baby Krogan, and she finally got to meet Klav, the Krogan from the tank. Rex was there with Bakara and Morden, who said, "Krogan live long lives. Solarians do not, but fortunately, I am too useful to die." Sinar smiled at him. "You did tell me at one point you could win big." "And I did. Solarians coming to Sanctuary in great numbers. I may be obsolete soon. You will be obsolete only when you decide it is so." "Excellent. No plans to be obsolete anytime soon. Continuing on through the crowd, they passed by a dance floor. She caught sight of Joker, who was straight-spined, dancing with a human woman. Jeff's frolics has been cured. Who's with him? Edie. She remains the AI of the Normandy, the resident AI of all vessels she had previously occupied and more. She is integrated into the Citadel and offers her aid to any vessel where she feels she could be of use. She networks as I do. She occupies many platforms and chose a human female platform to travel with Jeff. They remain on the Normandy, Helmoris commanding. She's beautiful. Indeed she is. Are Helmoris and Garrus here? Yes. Garrus's name in that form is RM. They are at the farmhouse. We shall go there next. Why aren't they here? Kara insists upon cooking. It could all be provided, of course, but she enjoys it. And she does not spend all day at the gatherings, usually attending only in the evenings. Helmoris, RM, Kimin, and Kerplunk live at the farmhouse, and they often keep Kara and Garrus company. The fairground was not far from the farmhouse. It was a beautiful walk through newly created trees and whimsical topiary. He took her arm again, his hand over hers. This had been, could have been, her life. It was an amazing life. She was glad for them. She contemplated the word divergence and its iterations. Knocking on the farmhouse door was surreal, and having the door answered by Garrus, who was not Garrus, even more so. He was prominently scarred through plate and hide. Vicarian blue hoops pierced through mandible and fringe. Her heart sped up and pounded. They stared at each other for long moments, without interruption other than the ringing in her ears. The interlude was interrupted by Russ's voice sounding from back in the house. "Who is it?" This was RM, whose eyes never left her as he said,
"Nobody. Door-to-door salespeople."
He grinned.
It'll take them a few minutes to figure that out. In the meantime...
RM grabbed her and lifted her into a huge hug.
Run away with me, little girl. They won't mind.
She was crying, her arms wrapped around him.
Missed you. He's making you happy? I mean, not right now. Clearly not happy right now.
She nodded, and he kissed the top of her head.
Good. If anybody asks, he's the one that made you cry.
Russ came into view behind RM. "If they're selling alcohol, buy." Then he stopped short, gray eyes stunned. He was also scarred, still huge. He'd been casually wiping his hands on a towel, which he dropped when he saw them.
Can I keep her?
No.
But she glows. She's clearly better.
I glow, dumbass.
Well, better than Kara, then.
Obviously that. Russ came forward. RM handed her over reluctantly, and Russ gave her his own hug. "You good? Need me to kill him?" "I'm good." "I'm so glad, because I really can't back that up. Come on to the kitchen." The kitchen was chaos. Kimin trying to keep Kerplunk away from the food. Clouds of... It took her a moment to identify them. Multicolored flying verse swarming around light sources in the room. Kara and Garrus did not notice them, but a particularly attentive verse did. A pup the size of a hand in wingspan, and soon she and Sonar both had orbiting baby verse.
They're like moths. They won't stop.
Kerplunk noticed their entrance, took off in a huge leap, and attempted to tackle Senar, who didn't move but did start scratching her head as she stood with her paws on his shoulders. Kittens bolted over next, scarred herself, flaring blue with excitement, and throwing herself into a hug with Dralatem. Garrus and Kara seemed immune to the chaos. They worked side by side on something. And when she tried to shift position to his other side to reach something, he picked her up, shifted her over, and deposited her at the new workstation. They were baking rolls. And she knew it was because it was bread from home. And that could be reproduced, but should not be replicated. It should be made by hand, at home. RM settled his hands on her shoulders. Kara and Garrus formed roles as she watched.
They won't notice. She might if someone says something mispronounced or trivial. Then she pays attention.
Russ said, "Hey, doofus." Garrus asked Kara.
Which one of us does he mean?
She shrugged. Probably both. I'll take this one. She looked up and dropped her roll as their eyes met. Garrus caught it and then turned to stare himself. Dralatem told them. He probably meant me. You guys, go back to what you're doing. It's important. Then she was quickly at the center of a hug where Kittens didn't let go. RM had his hands on her shoulders. Kara snuck in where Kittens wasn't. Garrus hugged around the women. Russ said, "Fuck it," and put his arms around all of them, saying, "I win." But she thought she won. Communion had lots of flavors. Senar smiled at her, scratching at Kerplunk's head still, who was in Varen ecstasy. All of them were now orbited by excited flying verse. She was with the people she loved. They were all so precious. She didn't really have much to say, but she loved listening to the stories. Everyone accepted her glowing and a 10-year span of absence, and she helped make bread in the established rhythms of the kitchen. Kara put out warm rolls and kiki nut butter. There was a tray dedicated to feeding Kerplunk that Russ manned. He fed her in intervals in order to keep her from taking anybody else's food. The verse settled down into a few baskets after rolls were put down for them. They talked about the Normandy, the farm. She caught up on the particulars of events through the years. Senar began to discuss the growing issue of concern regarding Leviathan, their potential for attempted conquest, and their threat of mental domination as Kittens watched and listened, rapt and fascinated. Kara threw a roll at Senar. "Stop it. You know the rule. No terror at the table."